an original story narrated exclusively for love written in silence. Lady Seraphina Vale stands perfectly still as the whispers ripple through the ballroom, her composed expression betraying nothing while her heart pounds beneath her silk gown. Across the room, Duke Dorian Ashcomb's gaze locks onto her with an intensity that contradicts years of careful restraint, his fingers tightening around his crystal glass as Lord Harrington bends to whisper in her ear. The summer light filters through tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished floor, where they've danced 100 times without ever truly touching. When the Duke approaches with measured steps that barely contain his urgency, the music seems to fade around them as he utters those 4 words that shatter years of elegant pretense. "Another man seeks you?" Seraphina lifts her chin, years of silent dignity crystallizing into a moment of perfect clarity as she prepares to speak a truth that will transform them both. Lady Seraphina Vale had perfected the art of graceful acceptance. At 26, she occupied that precarious position in society, respected enough to be included in every significant social gathering, yet unmarried long enough for whispers to occasionally follow her movements. Not that anyone would dare question her standing openly. The Vales had impeccable lineage, modest but sufficient wealth, and Seraphina herself possessed both beauty and that indefinable quality that made people listen when she spoke. For 3 seasons, Duke Dorian Ashcombe had been a constant presence in her life. His attention was meticulous. He requested precisely 2 dances at every ball, engaged her in thoughtful conversation at dinner parties, and occasionally sent perfectly appropriate books that aligned with discussions they'd shared. He was unfailingly courteous, undeniably attentive, and absolutely maddening in his restraint. "Lady Seraphina," he would say, bowing with perfect form as he approached her at each gathering. His voice carried that particular timbre that seemed reserved solely for her, slightly lower, more intimate than his public tone. "You look well this evening." "Your Grace," she would respond, the practiced curtsy as natural as breathing. "How kind of you to notice." This exchange, with minimal variations, had constituted the foundation of their relationship for years. Society observed with knowing smiles. Mothers of eligible daughters watched with resigned acceptance. Everyone understood the unspoken truth. The Duke of Ashcombe had selected Lady Seraphina Vale as the eventual recipient of his title and name. Everyone except, perhaps, Lady Seraphina herself, at the Winterton Spring Musicale last month. She had caught his gaze lingering on her profile as she turned a page of music for the pianist. For a moment, just one, something unguarded had flickered across his handsome features. Then it was gone, replaced by that familiar, pleasant mask. "You play beautifully," he'd commented afterward, though she hadn't touched the keys. "I merely turned the pages, Your Grace." Even so, his smile had been warm, genuine. "You bring music to any room you enter." Such moments sustained her. These brief glimpses behind his carefully maintained facade. Yet as the weeks passed into months and seasons into years, Seraphina found herself wondering if glimpses were all she would ever receive. Society had rules, of course. A man of the Duke's standing would be cautious, deliberate in his choices. Patience was expected of a lady, but patience, Seraphina had begun to realize, was not the same as passivity. At the Pembroke Garden party, watching him converse easily with the Earl of Westmoreland across the lawn, she made a decision. If the Duke of Ashcombe wished to maintain their elegant, restrained dance indefinitely, perhaps it was time to consider other partners. Lord Thomas Harrington's letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, requesting permission to call upon Lady Seraphina with the intention of formal courtship. It lay open beside her breakfast plate, the elegant script catching the morning light as she stirred her tea. "Will you receive him?" her aunt asked, eyeing the letter with undisguised interest. Seraphina considered the question carefully. Lord Harrington was respectable, pleasant, and possessed of a comfortable fortune. His estate bordered her family's country property. They had conversed easily at several gatherings. He was not the Duke, of course. But then, the Duke had never actually declared himself. "Yes," she said finally, "I believe I shall." Her aunt's eyebrows rose slightly. "I had thought, that is, society seems to expect, that the Duke of Ashcombe might eventually speak." Seraphina finished for her. "Perhaps, but after 3 years of expectation, I find myself wondering if society might be mistaken." The news traveled quickly, as news always did. Lord Harrington's first official call was noted by the housekeeper next door, who mentioned it to her mistress, who commented upon it at tea with Lady Blackwood, who raised the subject, delicately, with the Countess of Merryweather. All of London knew that Lady Seraphina Vale was entertaining Lord Harrington's courtship. "He seems very sincere," Seraphina remarked to her friend, Lady Eleanor, as they walked through Hyde Park, "and his conversation is engaging." "But he is not the Duke," Eleanor observed quietly. Seraphina's pace remained steady, her expression serene. "The Duke has not asked for anything beyond the pleasure of my company at social gatherings. Everyone knows his intentions." "Do they?" Seraphina stopped to adjust her glove. "I wonder then why he has never seen fit to share these intentions with me." Lord Harrington proved to be an attentive suitor. He brought flowers, selected with thought, rather than mere extravagance. He listened when she spoke of books and music. When he escorted her to the theater, his manner was respectful, his attention undivided. "You seem happy," her aunt commented after his third visit. Seraphina considered this. "I am content," she decided. Lord Harrington makes no mystery of his regard. As the days passed, whispers continued. At the Derwent ball, she felt the weight of curious glances as Lord Harrington claimed his second dance. Across the room, the Duke of Ashcombe watched, his expression unreadable. The Countess of Rothbury's summer soirée was in full bloom when Seraphina first noticed the change in the Duke's demeanor. He stood by the terrace doors, a glass of champagne untouched in his hand, his gaze following her movements with an intensity that was new and unmistakable. Lord Harrington had just returned from fetching her a glass of punch when the Duke approached, his steps measured but purposeful. "Lady Seraphina," he said, bowing with his usual perfect form. Yet something in his voice had shifted, a tightness, a controlled restraint that hadn't been there before. "Your Grace," she curtsied, noting how his eyes briefly flickered to Lord Harrington before returning to her face. "I had hoped to secure a dance this evening," the Duke continued. "But I see your card may already be full." "Not entirely, Your Grace," she replied evenly. "The waltz before supper remains unclaimed." A subtle tension eased from his shoulders. "Then I shall look forward to it." As he walked away, Lord Harrington leaned closer. "The Duke seems particularly attentive tonight." "Does he?" Seraphina kept her tone light. "I hadn't noticed any change." When the orchestra began the promised waltz, the Duke appeared at her side with such promptness that several nearby matrons exchanged knowing glances. His hand at her waist was proper, yet somehow more present than before. "You've been much occupied these past weeks," he observed as they moved through the first turn. "Society keeps us all busy during the season." "Indeed." His jaw tightened slightly. "Lord Harrington seems especially determined to occupy your time." Seraphina met his gaze directly. "He has been kind enough to express his interest clearly." The Duke's steps faltered almost imperceptibly, a hair's breadth of hesitation that no one else would have noticed. But Seraphina, attuned to his every movement after years of their careful dance, felt it immediately. "Another man seeks you." The words came quietly, almost to himself. He had stopped moving entirely, frozen in place, as the other dancers continued around them. The music played on, but they stood motionless in the center of the floor, a still point in the swirling pattern of couples. The naked emotion in his voice, jealousy, surprise, perhaps even fear, was so unlike his usual controlled manner that Seraphina felt her carefully maintained composure waver. "Yes," she said simply, meeting his gaze. "And I will not pretend to be content with courtesy." Something flickered in his eyes, recognition, perhaps, or realization. Then, with a slight inclination of his head, he resumed their dance, his grip on her waist a fraction tighter than before. In the fortnight following the Rothbury soirée, London society witnessed a subtle but unmistakable shift in the Duke of Ashcombe's habits. He arrived earlier at gatherings and departed later. He appeared at smaller, more intimate events he might previously have declined. Most notably, wherever Lady Seraphina Vale was expected, the Duke invariably materialized. "He's become quite persistent," Lady Eleanor observed as they prepared for the Hartfield musical evening. "I've never seen him attend 3 afternoon teas in succession before." Seraphina adjusted her pearl earring, keeping her expression neutral. "Perhaps he's developed a sudden fondness for cucumber sandwiches, or perhaps," Eleanor suggested with a knowing smile, He's developed a sudden fear of losing something he believed securely his. The truth of her friend's observation was difficult to deny. The Duke's increased presence was matched by subtle changes in his behavior. A new intentionality in his conversation, a watchfulness when Lord Harrington approached. A tendency to position himself where he could observe Serafina without being obvious. For her part, Serafina maintained her composed facade with practiced grace. She greeted the Duke with the same polite warmth she always had, danced with him when asked, and engaged in their usual thoughtful discussions. If her heart quickened when he entered a room, if she found herself more aware of his location than anyone else's, she revealed nothing. Lord Harrington continued his attentions with steady dedication. His courtship was proceeding exactly as society expected. Proper calls paid, appropriate compliments offered, suitable gifts presented. He was everything correct and admirable in a suitor. "Your admirer seems most devoted," the Duke commented one evening as they stood observing a game of whist. Lord Harrington was partnered with Serafina's aunt across the room. "He's been very consistent in his attentions," she agreed. "And you find consistency appealing?" Something in his tone made her turn to study his profile. "I find honesty appealing, Your Grace. When a gentleman makes his intentions clear, a lady need not waste time in speculation." The Duke's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around his glass. Some matters of importance require careful consideration before declaration. 3 years seems ample time for consideration, does it not? His gaze met hers, startled by her directness. Before he could respond, they were interrupted by Lady Blackwood, requesting the Duke's opinion on some political matter. Serafina used the opportunity to slip away, her heart beating faster than her calm exterior suggested. Society, ever attentive to the nuances of courtship among its members, watched this triangle with increasing interest. Whispers followed Serafina at every gathering. Speculation about the Duke's intentions grew. Even Lord Harrington seemed aware of the shifting dynamics, his manner becoming more publicly possessive, his claims on Serafina's time more frequent. "You've become the most fascinating drama of the season," Eleanor told her with a laugh. "Everyone is waiting to see which gentleman will prevail." Serafina smiled faintly. "Perhaps neither shall. I am not a prize to be won." The revelation came not as a dramatic disclosure, but as a quiet moment of clarity. Serafina was seated beside Lord Harrington in the Merryweathers' drawing room when Lady Prescott approached with her daughter. "Lord Harrington, how delightful to see you again," Lady Prescott gushed. "You remember my Catherine, of course. She was just remarking on your excellent taste in music at the Wintertons' concert." "Lady Catherine," he acknowledged with a polite nod. "Your memory flatters me." "Not at all," the young woman replied. "Your observations about Mozart were most insightful." Serafina watched as Lord Harrington launched into a nearly identical discourse on classical composition that he had shared with her just days before. The same phrases, the same measured enthusiasm, even the same anecdote about a performance he had attended in Vienna. It wasn't improper, merely rehearsed, practiced. A performance designed to impress rather than express. In that moment, Serafina recognized something fundamental. Lord Harrington was courting her with the same careful strategy he would employ with any suitable candidate for his future countess. When Lady Prescott and her daughter moved on, Serafina turned to him with newfound clarity. "Tell me, Lord Harrington, what specifically drew you to seek my hand above others?" He seemed momentarily startled by the directness of her question, but recovered smoothly. "Your reputation for grace and intelligence is well known, Lady Serafina. Our family's estates adjoin most conveniently, and your connections would complement my own. We are well matched in age and standing." He smiled, pleased with his answer. "I believe we could build a most satisfactory life together. Not a word of affection, not a hint of particular regard, just practical considerations, sensibly arranged." "I see," she said quietly. "Thank you for your honesty." Later that evening, seeking a moment of solitude, Serafina retreated to the Merryweathers' music room. She was surprised to find the Duke already there, standing by the pianoforte, his fingers resting lightly on its polished surface. "Lady Serafina," he said, turning at her entrance. "I hope I'm not intruding on your privacy." "Not at all, Your Grace. I was merely seeking a moment of quiet." He studied her face. "You seem troubled." "Not troubled," she corrected. "Perhaps enlightened. May I ask about what? Serafina moved to the window, looking out at the evening garden. I've realized that dignity isn't found in silence, or in accepting what is merely convenient. True dignity requires honesty, with others and with oneself. The Duke moved closer, not touching her, but near enough that she could feel his presence. And what truth have you discovered? She turned to face him directly. That I would rather face rejection after speaking my heart than spend a lifetime wondering what might have been if I had found the courage to speak at all, as May yielded to June. The pressure of society's expectations grew more palpable. Lady Blackwood had mentioned, with studied casualness, that Lord Harrington had been seen at Rundle and Bridge, examining rings. Mrs. Fitzwilliam had inquired, with poorly disguised interest, whether Serafina had given thought to a summer or autumn wedding. Even her aunt had begun subtly rearranging household accounts, as if preparing for a change in the family's circumstances. People expect an announcement soon, Eleanor warned her during a morning call. Lord Harrington has made his intentions clear enough that society considers it nearly settled. Does society indeed? Serafina replied, arranging flowers with particular attention to their placement. How convenient for society to have decided my future without consulting me. Eleanor leaned closer, lowering her voice, though they were alone. And the Duke. He watches you constantly, you know, at the Pembroke dinner. He barely touched his food. Serafina's hands stilled momentarily. He has had years to speak, if speaking was his intention. Perhaps he was afraid. Of what? Rejection. Serafina shook her head. He must know I would not have. She stopped herself, realizing the admission implicit in her words. Would not have rejected him. Eleanor finished gently. I think everyone knows that, except perhaps the Duke himself. The Duchess of Montfort's summer ball loomed on the horizon, the last major event before many families departed London for their country estates. Rumors circulated that Lord Harrington planned to make a formal announcement there, with the Duchess's blessing. Meanwhile, the Duke of Ashcombe seemed caught in his own internal struggle. Twice he had approached Serafina at gatherings, his manner suggesting he had something significant to say, only to retreat into conventional pleasantries when others joined their conversation. Once, she had caught him watching her with such naked longing that her breath had caught. But when their eyes met, his expression had immediately returned to its usual controlled mask. The Duke called this morning. Her aunt mentioned casually over breakfast, 3 days before the Montfort ball. He left this for you. The small package contained a book, a volume of poetry they had discussed months ago. Inside was a simple note in his precise handwriting. The truth in these pages speaks more eloquently than I ever could. Serafina opened to where he had placed a silk ribbon marker. The poem spoke of silence and fear, of words unspoken and chances lost. The last stanza asked if courage found too late was still courage worth honoring. She traced the words with her fingertip, understanding the message beneath the gift. He was afraid, not of her rejection, perhaps, but of his own vulnerability. The Duke of Ashcombe, always so controlled and proper, feared the disorder of true emotion. As she prepared for the Montfort ball, Serafina made her own decision. Whatever happened that night, she would no longer participate in a game where the rules prevented honesty. Dignity required truth, not silence, and she was ready to speak hers, whatever the consequence. The Duchess of Montfort's ballroom glittered with crystal chandeliers and the jewels of London's elite. Summer flowers cascaded from tall silver urns, their scent mingling with perfume and beeswax candles. The orchestra played a lively country dance as Serafina entered on her aunt's arm, her gown of pale blue silk catching the light with each movement. She felt the Duke's presence before she saw him. Something in the air changed, a subtle shift in energy that she had grown attuned to over the years. He stood near a column, in conversation with Lord Westmoreland, but his eyes found hers immediately across the crowded room. Lady Serafina, the Duchess of Montfort greeted her warmly. How lovely you look this evening. Lord Harrington has been most anxious for your arrival. As if summoned by his name, Lord Harrington appeared at her side, bowing elegantly. Lady Serafina, you outshine every flower in the room. You're too kind, my lord, she replied, accepting his arm as he led her toward the dance floor. Throughout their set, Serafina was acutely aware of the Duke's gaze following their movements. Lord Harrington, too, seemed particularly attentive, his manner more possessive than usual. "I hope to speak with you privately later this evening," he murmured as they turned through the figures of the dance. "There is a matter of some importance I wish to discuss." Serafina nodded, though a sense of unease settled in her chest. The weight of expectation, from Lord Harrington, from society, from herself, pressed upon her like a physical thing as the evening progressed. She found herself increasingly withdrawn, responding to conversation with practiced phrases, while her mind circled around the choice before her. Lord Harrington represented security, respectability, a life of comfortable predictability. The Duke represented something far less certain, but infinitely more true to her heart. Shortly before supper was announced, Lord Harrington approached her where she stood with Eleanor and several other ladies. "Lady Serafina, might I have a moment?" His voice carried just enough to draw the attention of those nearby. Intentionally, she realized. He was creating an audience. As she took his arm, Serafina noticed the Duchess watching with obvious approval. Several conversations quieted. Even the Duke had moved closer, his expression carefully neutral, but his eyes intense. Lord Harrington led her to a slightly raised area near the orchestra, positioning them where they could be easily observed. "Lady Serafina," he began, his voice pitched to Carrie, "over these past weeks, I have come to admire your many qualities. Your grace, your intelligence, your impeccable lineage, all recommend you as a woman of exceptional merit." Serafina felt rather than saw the gathered attention of the room turning toward them. This was it, the public declaration, the moment society had been anticipating. "I believe," Lord Harrington continued, "that an alliance between our families would be advantageous to both. Therefore, I would like to formally request—" "My lord," Serafina interrupted gently but firmly, "I thank you for your kind attention these past weeks. However, I must ask that you not continue." Lord Harrington blinked, momentarily thrown off his carefully prepared speech. "I beg your pardon? I cannot accept what you wish to offer," she said clearly. "Not when it is based on convenience, rather than affection." A ripple of whispers spread through the ballroom. Lord Harrington's expression shifted from confusion to embarrassment. "Lady Serafina," he said, lowering his voice, "perhaps we should continue this conversation privately." "There is nothing more to discuss, my lord," she replied with quiet dignity. "I wish you well, but I cannot encourage hopes I have no intention of fulfilling," as she turned to move away from the awkward tableau they had created. Serafina found herself face to face with the Duke of Ashcombe. He had moved closer during the exchange, and now stood barely an arm's length away, his presence commanding attention without any word spoken. For a moment, no one moved. The orchestra had fallen silent between pieces. The gathered society held its collective breath, sensing that something momentous was unfolding before them. "Lady Serafina," the Duke said, his voice steady and clear enough to be heard by those nearby, "would you honor me with the next dance?" The simplicity of the request, so ordinary in any other context, carried unmistakable weight in this charged moment. Serafina met his gaze, seeing in his eyes what he was truly offering, not just a dance, but a public alignment with her, at the precise moment when she had rejected another. "I would be delighted, Your Grace," she answered. As he led her onto the floor, the orchestra began a waltz. Other couples joined them, but Serafina was aware of the speculative glances, the whispered observations. The Duke's hand at her waist was proper, but unmistakably possessive. "That was bravely done," he said quietly as they moved through the first turn. "Which part, Your Grace?" "Rejecting a perfectly respectable offer, or accepting a dance with you immediately after." A smile touched his lips, more genuine than his usual controlled expression. "Both, I should think." They completed several turns in silence before he spoke again. "Lady Serafina, I must apologize for my silence these past years. I believe that my attention made my intentions clear. But I see now that actions without words can be misinterpreted." "And what are your intentions, Your Grace?" she asked, her heart beating faster despite her outward composure. The Duke's steps slowed as the music approached its conclusion. "To correct any misunderstanding about your standing, it should be known that you have been, and remain, the only woman I have ever considered as my Duchess." The waltz ended. They stood facing each other as the other dancers began to move away. The Duke raised her hand to his lips in a gesture that, while entirely proper, carried unmistakable meaning to every watching eye. "Lady Seraphina has done me the honor of allowing me to court her," he announced, his voice carrying just enough to reach those nearest them. I would be grateful if this understanding were respected. It wasn't a proposal, not yet, but it was a clear public declaration of intent that no one in society could misinterpret. The Duke had claimed her, not as a possession, but as his chosen companion. As they moved toward the supper room, Seraphina felt the weight of society's gaze shift from speculation to acceptance. The Duchess of Montfort herself approached to offer congratulations, as if an engagement had already been announced. Lord Harrington had disappeared from the ballroom entirely. "Will you meet me in the music room after supper?" the Duke asked quietly. "There are things I wish to say that are not meant for public ears." The Montfort's music room stood apart from the main ballroom, connected by a short corridor that muffled the sounds of the orchestra and conversation. Seraphina entered to find it empty save for the Duke, who stood by the pianoforte, much as he had at the Merryweathers weeks before. He turned at the sound of her entrance, his expression more open than she had ever seen it. "Thank you for coming. Your declaration has caused quite a stir," she said, closing the door behind her. "I believe Lady Blackwood is already planning our wedding breakfast." A smile touched his lips. "Society moves quickly when given direction. And is that what you intended? To give society direction?" "No." He moved toward her, stopping at a respectful distance. "I intended to give myself direction. To finally act on what I have felt for 3 years, but lacked the courage to express." Seraphina studied him. This man who had occupied so much of her thoughts for so long. "Before you say more, I must establish something between us, Your Grace." "Dorian," he corrected gently. "If we are to speak honestly, let us at least use our given names." "Dorian, then." The intimacy of his name on her lips sent a small thrill through her. "I need you to understand that I will not accept pretty words offered in jealousy or fear of loss. If you speak now, only because another man sought me, then I would rather you remained silent." His expression grew serious. "A fair condition. May I respond?" When she nodded, he continued. "I have loved you since you challenged my opinion on Wordsworth at Lady Harlow's dinner 3 years ago. No one had ever disagreed with me so eloquently, or with such conviction. I determined that evening that you were the only woman I could imagine spending my life with." "Then why the silence?" she asked. "Why years of attention without declaration?" "Fear," he admitted simply. "Not of your rejection, but of my own inadequacy. My parents' marriage was a cold, proper arrangement that brought them mutual respect, but no joy. I feared I lacked the capacity for the kind of love you deserve, that my affection, once declared, would prove insufficient." Seraphina's breath caught at his honesty. "And now? Now I understand that silence is not protection but cowardice. Seeing you with Harrington made me realize that I would rather risk loving imperfectly than lose you to someone who would never love you at all." He took a step closer, close enough that she could see the vulnerability in his eyes. "I cannot promise I will always express myself well, Seraphina, but I can promise that what I feel for you is real and has nothing to do with convenience or advantage. That is all I have ever wanted," she said softly. "Not perfection, but truth. Then may I court you properly, not with the restraint of these past years, but with honest intention?" Instead of answering immediately, Seraphina closed the remaining distance between them and placed her hand gently against his cheek. "Yes, Dorian. I believe it's time we both stopped hiding." In the days following the Montfort ball, London society adjusted to the new understanding between Lady Seraphina Vale and the Duke of Ashcombe with remarkable speed. What had been whispered speculation transformed overnight into accepted fact. Invitations arrived addressed to them as a pair. Seating arrangements at dinners placed them side by side. The transition was so seamless that one might have believed nothing had changed at all, except everything had changed. Gone was the careful distance Dorian had maintained for years. In its place was a new openness, small gestures that spoke volumes to those who observed them. His hand beneath her elbow as they entered a room. The way he leaned slightly closer when she spoke. The unguarded smile that appeared when she entered his line of sight. "You've transformed him," the Countess of Westmoreland remarked to Seraphina during a garden party. "I've known Dorian since he was a boy, and I've never seen him so at ease." For her part, Serafina found herself shedding layers of practiced composure. The constant vigilance she had maintained, never revealing too much, never showing disappointment at his restraint, gave way to a more authentic presence. She laughed more freely. She expressed opinions more directly. She allowed herself to simply be, rather than perform the role, the patient, perfect lady. Their courtship proceeded with a quiet intensity that had nothing to do with society's expectations, and everything to do with their growing understanding of each other. Dorian called at her home regularly, bringing books they might discuss rather than flowers that would wither. They took walks in the park, their conversations ranging from philosophy to childhood memories to hopes for the future. I spent so many years believing that control was the same as character, Dorian confessed during one such walk. My father taught me that a gentleman never reveals himself, that dignity lies in restraint. And now, Serafina asked, her hand resting lightly on his arm, now I understand that true dignity comes from honesty, not concealment. He covered her hand with his own. You taught me that, Serafina. The transformation wasn't always smooth. There were moments when old habits reasserted themselves, when Dorian retreated into formality under the weight of public scrutiny, or when Serafina caught herself measuring her words too carefully. But these instances grew rarer as they established a new pattern between them, one based on truth rather than expectation. One afternoon, the British Museum with her aunt as chaperone, Dorian surprised her by speaking of their future with unexpected directness. I would like to be married before autumn, he said, as they examined a Roman sculpture. Unless you prefer a longer engagement. Serafina smiled at his blend of decisiveness and consideration. Before autumn would be perfect. I've waited quite long enough, I think. Far too long, he agreed, his eyes warm with promise. I don't intend to waste any more time. Her aunt, pretending great interest in a nearby exhibit, smiled to herself as she observed the quiet intimacy that had grown between them, not the showy affection of new lovers, but the steady connection of two people who had finally found their way to each other. The evening before Serafina was to depart for her family's country estate, Dorian arranged a small gathering at his London home, just a dozen guests, close friends and family who had supported their courtship. The formal announcement of their engagement had been published that morning, making official what society had already accepted as fact. After dinner, they moved to the music room, a beautiful space with tall windows and perfect acoustics. At Dorian's request, Serafina seated herself at the pianoforte. Will you play for us? He asked. The Beethoven piece you mentioned loving. She had never performed for him before, always demurring when asked at other gatherings. Now with their understanding complete and their future decided, she nodded and placed her fingers on the keys. The sonata began softly, building gradually in complexity and emotion. Serafina lost herself in the music, aware of Dorian watching her with undisguised admiration. When the final notes faded, the small audience applauded warmly. That was beautiful, Dorian said, joining her at the instrument. Why have you never played for me before? I needed to be certain you were listening to me, not just the music, she answered honestly. As the evening progressed and guests began to depart, Dorian drew Serafina aside. There's something I want to show you. He led her down a corridor to a smaller, more intimate music room she hadn't seen before. Unlike the formal space they had just left, this room had a lived-in quality. Books stacked beside a comfortable chair, a desk with papers arranged in neat piles, and a pianoforte, positioned to catch the morning light. This is my private sanctuary, he explained. No one else comes here. I wanted you to see it before you leave for the country. Serafina understood the significance of the gesture. This wasn't the Duke showing a formal space to a guest, but Dorian inviting Serafina into the private world he maintained behind his public persona. It suits you, she said, trailing her fingers along the spines of his books. I can imagine you here, away from the demands of your title. I'd like you to consider it yours as well. He moved to stand beside her. After we're married, I want no rooms in our home closed to you, no parts of myself kept separate. The promise in his words, not just of shared space, but of shared self, touched her deeply. Serafina turned to face him, finding in his expression all the openness she had once feared he was incapable of showing. Play with me, she suggested, moving to the pianoforte. A duet this time. They sat side by side on the bench, their shoulders touching as they positioned their hands. The piece they selected was one that required perfect coordination, each part complementing the other to create a harmonious whole. As they played together, Serafina realized that this was what she had always wanted. Not grand gestures or public declarations, but this quiet certainty of being truly seen and known by the person she loved. The music flowed between them, neither leading nor following, but moving in perfect synchrony. This time, unlike at the Merryweathers months ago, there were no interruptions, no retreating behind masks of propriety. Just the pure expression of two people who had finally found the courage to be authentic with each other. 1 month later, Serafina stood in the garden of the Vale Country Estate, watching as Dorian conversed with her father near the rose arbor. Their heads were bent together in serious discussion, though occasional smiles suggested the topic was pleasant. The summer sun caught the gold of Dorian's hair, and Serafina found herself marveling at how different he looked now. More relaxed, more present, more himself. "Your Duke seems quite at home here," Eleanor observed, joining her on the stone bench. "I've never seen him so at ease in company." "He's learning that he needn't maintain constant vigilance," Serafina replied. "That being known isn't the same as being vulnerable." Their wedding was scheduled for September, a small ceremony by ducal standards, but exactly what they both wanted. The preparations proceeded with remarkably little drama, perhaps because neither of them cared overmuch for the details society deemed important. What mattered was the life they would build afterward, not the single day that marked its formal beginning. The transformation that had begun at the Montfort ball continued to deepen as they spent time together away from London's watchful eyes, here in the country. Without the constant pressure of social expectations, they discovered new aspects of each other daily. Dorian had revealed a surprising fondness for early morning walks and an unexpected talent for sketching landscapes. Serafina had shared her secret collection of rather unfashionable adventure novels and her habit of speaking to plants while gardening, small revelations perhaps, but each one a thread in the tapestry of genuine intimacy they were weaving between them. "He watches you constantly, you know," Eleanor said, nodding toward Dorian, who had indeed glanced their way, not like before, not with uncertainty, but with such contentment. "We've both stopped performing and started living," Serafina explained. "It makes all the difference." That evening after dinner, they gathered in the music room. It had become their ritual, this shared time with music, sometimes playing together, sometimes with Serafina playing while Dorian listened, sometimes simply sitting in companionable silence as music filled the space around them. Tonight, Serafina selected a piece they had begun on the evening before her departure from London, a complex duet they had been practicing separately during their weeks apart. As they sat together at the pianoforte, their hands moving in harmony across the keys, Serafina felt the rightness of their connection. This was what truth had given them, not the dramatic passion of novels, but something deeper and more lasting, a foundation of honesty upon which they could build a lifetime. The music flowed between them, each note building on the last, creating a melody that was neither hers nor his but uniquely theirs. When the final chord resolved, they remained seated, shoulders touching, in the perfect silence that follows true harmony. "I love you," Dorian said simply, the words no longer difficult for him to speak. Serafina turned to meet his gaze, finding in his eyes all the certainty she had once feared he lacked. "And I love you. Not the Duke, not the perfect gentleman, just you." His smile, open, unguarded, completely genuine, was all the response she needed. The music they had once left unfinished now continued, flowing into a future neither of them could have imagined when they were still hiding behind masks of propriety and restraint. They had discovered was not an ending but a beginning, the first notes of a melody that would continue, uninterrupted, for all the days to come.